Last month, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld a Michigan law in which voters said that affirmative action policy should no longer be considered when minorities are applying to enter a university. Now, many in the civil rights legal community see this as a setback. We have joining us this morning Chuck Walker, former director of the Massachusetts Commission Against Discrimination and head of the Boston Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. Welcome to Urban Update. Thanks for coming in, Chuck.
Thank you, Byron.
Great to have you back here.
It's good to be here.
Let's go right to it. First of all, this ruling, this Supreme Court ruling in Michigan on affirmative action. Very quick synopsis. What is the ruling? What did it say?
Well, first, it wasn't a ruling on affirmative action per se. It was essentially the Supreme Court, the voters of Michigan, after the Grutter decision came down, which said you can use race as a consideration for admissions. The voters put together a referendum. The referendum amended the state constitution that barred use of race in admissions, summarizing it to a fault. And there was a challenge to whether that referendum was constitutional. And the voter and the Supreme Court said, hey, it's not so much a referendum; it's whether the voters can override or seek a repeal of a legislature that has passed laws to remedy discrimination, whether they can do that by a referendum. And the Supreme Court said yes. Well,
now, in your view, is this a retrenchment in terms of opportunities for people of color?
It is. That's a euphemism for it. Yeah, it is a retrenchment. It is more than 2 steps forward, more than 2 steps back, 1 step backward. It is it's going back to even my personal history, to 60 years. Here we are in the 60th year of Brown v. Board of Education, and which propelled end of segregation in public schools. Now we're past that, at least a little bit. And there have been constant attacks to knocking out Brown or reducing Brown or compromising it. Now, this is another stab by the conservative right to eliminate the effects of minorities, blacks, Hispanics, Asians, in having equal access to college and getting a good education.
Is affirmative action still needed in 2014?
I think that, and I hate to challenge, lawyers always like to change questions around. It is. It's what is the effect of affirmative action? It's who is it for? The affirmative action is not simply to benefit minorities, and I think that's just an unfortunate misnomer. It's to benefit all of America. And quite frankly,
who's benefited most by affirmative action?
Well, scholars and pundits say, Caucasian women have been the greatest beneficiaries. But the fact of the matter is, it's a good way of redressing centuries, certainly decades, of histories of discrimination, of people who are disenfranchised, underrepresented minorities that have been excluded based upon their race.
How can people in Michigan and around the country? Well, first of all, do you think this will have national implications?
It is. It was a Supreme Court decision.
How do you think people can respond to this, or can people respond to this? Well, the High Court, that's the last word.
I would commend the public to read Justice Sotomayor's extraordinary dissenting opinion to go to good sense. It was scholarly, it was practical, and it was personal. And the short of it is, how can we respond? We could also oppose any referendums that want to outdo or want to do something that's going to impose or impact efforts to take underrepresented people into the schools.
What strikes me is that, with the demographics changing such as they are, the country getting browner and browner, and we have a court decision like this, all of these things happening, I guess, what is going on here? Where's this disconnect?
It's not so much a disconnect, and I think some people have sat on their hands and sat on their laurels. We think the civil rights movement did its thing, and it was very effective. And after King died, we got the Housing Acts, we got the 65 Voting Rights Act, and then we just celebrated the 64 Civil Rights Act. And we're just relying upon but the federal government and the Supreme Court turning on these people now, turning on the underrepresented essentially, by not being the saviors that they were during the time of the Civil Rights Movement.
And I just want to get one more thing in here. The 60th anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education, and you mentioned it. We talked about it on some of the earlier segments. I guess talk to me about, the significance of that, and if you want to chime in on this Boston City Council controversy about some councilors who are not voting to honor it because of they somehow equate it with busing. What do you think? What do you think about that?
Well, I was 2 years old when it came down. And my parents told me that there was celebrations in the streets. It was like ticker tape parades. It was the most phenomenal Supreme Court decision ever issued. Thurgood Marshall argued the case. It was a unanimous decision to override to end segregation in this country, something that should have never existed. But from 1896 to 1954, you had segregation. Now the Supreme Court unanimously, under a new Chief Justice, Earl Warren, says no more, no more. It's the end. And you had a unanimous Supreme Court. It's something that should be celebrated all the time.
And to equate that with, or to somehow put that in the same sentence with busing, as if that somehow caused the busing problem in Boston very quickly?
Of course not. And it was reckless and unfortunate that the city councilors could only vote present as opposed to vote what their conscience should have told them, and that is to really recognize the significance of this decision, what it meant to everybody. And I have to add this, Byron. The separate but equal doctrine was not established by Plessy versus Ferguson. It was established right here in Boston, Massachusetts, with the Roberts versus School Committee case in 1850, the first school desegregation case ever passed. And the United States Supreme Court used that in Plessy 40 years later.
That's right. And they used this case in Boston. They used 100 years later in Brown, some of the same arguments.
Exactly.
Chuck Walker, thanks for coming in. Professor Walker.
It's my pleasure.
It's always fun and educational. Okay.